Uqba bin Abi Mu'ayt would of course go on to become one of the greatest enemies of the Messenger ﷺ, someone who put guts on the back of the Prophet ﷺ, camel guts on the back of the Prophet ﷺ, humiliated him, and was one of the staunchest enemies of the Prophet ﷺ. And one of the people who received the dua of the Prophet ﷺ against him. Doesn't happen to too many people. So Uqba bin Abi Mu'ayt is a really evil person, a very arrogant person, a very powerful man. And Ibn Masood radiallahu anhu was one of his shepherds, and he was only 13 years old when he was sent to be a shepherd for Uqba bin Abi Mu'ayt. All right? So look at this incident. The Prophet ﷺ and Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala anhu, they pass by Abdullah bin Masood. He doesn't know who they are, and they don't know who he is. All right? They just see this young man that's a shepherd of sheep on the outskirts of Mecca. So the Prophet ﷺ, he asks Abdullah bin Masood, he says to him, "Oh young man, Ibn Am," he says, my nephew, he says, "Would you mind giving us some milk from one of these goats? We're travelers." Abdullah bin Masood radiallahu anhu said, "I can't, I've been entrusted. These aren't my goats, I can't give you any milk." Not knowing it's the Prophet ﷺ. Do you think the Prophet ﷺ was upset with him? No. The Prophet ﷺ was impressed. So he said to him, "هَلْ لَكَ مِنْ شَاةٍ لَا لَبَنَ فِيهِ." He says, "Well, do you have a goat that doesn't produce milk?" So he said, "Sure, but what are you going to do with it?" He said, "Just bring it over." So Abdullah bin Masood radiallahu anhu brought it. So he said, the Prophet ﷺ, وَضَعَ النَّبِيُّ صلى الله عليه وسلم يَدَهُ عَلَى ضَرْعِ الشَّاةِ. He put it on the udders of that goat, and the Prophet ﷺ said, "Bismillah." And so it suddenly started to produce milk, plentiful milk. So he said the Prophet ﷺ gave a cup to Abu Bakr, he gave me some, and then he drank from it too. So we all ended up drinking from this goat that wasn't producing milk. So he said, after that, عَادَتْ كَمَا كَانَتْ, the goat went back to not producing any milk. So Abdullah bin Masood has no idea what's going on. So he says to the Prophet ﷺ, Ya am, oh my uncle, عَلِّمْنِي مِنْ هَذَا الْقَوْلِ الَّذِي قُلْتِ. He thought it was in the words. He said, "What were those words you said? Teach me the words that you said." Because he heard Bismillah, he thought, okay, if I say the same words, maybe I can start doing this too. So he says, the Prophet ﷺ smiled, فَمَسَحَ عَلَى صَدْرِي, and he wiped his hand on my chest, like he was praising me, and he says, إِنَّكَ غُلَامٌ مُعَلَّمٌ. You're a learned and trustworthy young man. You're a good young man. Then he left him. Ibn Masood, of course, went to Mecca and started trying to find him and asked about him until he found him and accepted Islam right away. When he found out that the Prophet ﷺ was calling to this new message. So that's one incident where you found a person who was praised for their trustworthiness, even though he was working for an evil man. For an evil man. So you can't say, for example, I'm an employee for an evil person, so that means I can mess around a little bit. It doesn't work that way.